Our next topic is, we're calling it a new bread has sprouted. Actually, they called it. Peggy and Joe and Carolyn got together. A new bread has sprouted. Baking with sprouted grains the next 100 years. So, you know, with the theme of the symposium being the future of bread, we want to see, okay, what's coming? What are the things that we need to know about? This is already coming. A couple years ago, it was a wave out on the outer coast, and now it's a wave that has splashed on the shore, and it's happening. So they're going to give us updates on where it's at and how it got there and how they do it. And then we want to get some conversation going about applications, future applications that you may see or that they can help you think through. And both Peggy and Joe are people that, and later I got to meet Caroline, and Joe's daughter, who got me kind of brought me into this whole world of sprouted grains. And then I ended up writing a whole book about it and featuring them both in the book because they opened it to me. And then, of course, as soon as I featured them, I started hearing from people all over the country, hey, what about us? We're doing sprouted grains too. And I think there's some folks here have done some sprouted grains. So we want to make sure that, this is part of the future of bread. And I'm going to let Peggy Sutton from To Your Health Sprouted Flour talk about it first. And then Joe and Caroline will continue on and take us the rest of the way home.
All right, so I really appreciate the opportunity today to talk about sprouted grains, which is something that I really enjoy doing. And you can tell by the fact that I have a company, To Your Health Sprouted Flour Company. Most folks just refer to us as Healthy Flour, the Healthy Flour Company. Because the name is quite a mouthful. So I've been in business sprouting grains for over 13 years now. I was certainly not the original pioneer. Sprouted grains have been around for a long time, but I fell in love with sprouting grains during a personal quest to make better bread for my family, and I haven't turned back yet. So it's been a great educational experience for everyone who would like to bake with sprouted grains. And that's kind of been my mission since I got into it. And we just happened to form a company as a result of that. To Your Health sprouts 28 different grains, legumes, seeds, and nuts now. So we're the largest producer. We're certainly not the only one. Joe and Caroline are also one of the pioneers in the modern sprouted grain movement, and now we have several emerging sprouters that have also joined the team, which is not a bad thing at all because the demand for sprouted grains and sprouted grain flours has gone up tremendously. So Eric did a great job this morning talking about the history of sourdough, and the history of sprouted grains goes back at least that far. I know that there are some Egyptian scrolls that are dated 3000 BC that talk about the increased nutrition of sprouting the grains before consuming them. And of course, the Egyptians, and over the years until the Industrial Revolution, they didn't harvest the grain with a combine, and they didn't put those grains in grain dryers to get the moisture down. So natural sprouting was going on way back when. And of course, the grains were that much more nutritious having naturally sprouted than some of the grains that we consume today. I'd like to think that over the years, going back so far, and then with the Industrial Revolution, when we were urbanizing and everyone was forming cities, all of a sudden leaving the grains in the field was not a good thing. As a matter of fact, sprouted grain became something that you wanted to avoid at all costs because you couldn't transport and store grains if they were sprouted or the moisture content was too high because they would mold in the bins in the cities that they were being transported to. So fast forward to today, we are seeing a reemergence in interest in sprouted grains. And what Joe and Caroline and I do right now is we have kind of rebirthed an old time-honored tradition, And we do it, though, in a more modern way and in a safer way. So sprouted grains, a couple of years ago, when I started my business, it was just a small niche, and there were a few people, the old traditional food people, who were interested in cooking with sprouted grain flours. Now, a couple of years ago, it has finally hit mainstream. There are more than 1,500 sprouted grain products on the market today. Anywhere from breads to tortillas, chips, crackers, cereals, bars, even soups. Sprouted legume soups are emerging on the market. So, what exactly is sprouted grain and why the increased interest? This is a picture of some sprouted spelt being a wheat variety that until recently has been unhybridized or considered an ancient grain. And you can tell by the picture that the grain is fully germinated, which is just another word for sprouted. And this is out of one of our sprouting machines. When I got started, I was sprouting in mason jars, and now we have special equipment that can take us through the whole process. For my company, from a raw grain, which is an unsprouted grain, to a sprouted flour is a full 3-day process. It involves a lot of water, a very controlled environment as far as temperature and conditions, and a lot of time to make sprouted grain flour. Of course, the visible sprout is very important. It certainly is an unmistakable way to tell that your grain is sprouted. This is also another nice example of sprouted blue corn, which is one of the products that we handle. And you can tell by the little protrusion on the end of the kernel. This is one of the grains that we also handle. This is quinoa. Makes a very nice flour and a very nice ingredient in a lot of bread products. And you see a lot of quinoa products on the market today. It's packed with a lot of nutrition to begin with. The sprouting process also takes out the bitterness and adds to the nutrition. Now, one way to know that you have oversprouted, this is a batch of oversprouted rye out of one of my sprout machines that went a little bonkers. So if you're going to cook it up for a salad, it'd be great. It's oversprouted, so for bread making, at this point, it would probably not make a great loaf of bread. And the reason why is you begin to lose some of the protein or gluten begins to break down when you've got oversprouting, and it takes on a grassy taste. So it loses performance in the baking process. I got started, like I said earlier, sprouting in mason jars. I still use my mason jars whenever I want to try sprouting something new. We get a lot of requests for things. So this is some sprouted wheat back in my commercial kitchen. I think this goes back to probably 2007. And this is perfectly sprouted wheat berries. You see just a little tail that comes out. I call it an antenna that pops out of the end of the grain. And a lot of different things happen once you have reached this point of sprouting a grain. It really transforms from being a dormant seed to a living plant. And there are a lot of things that happen. You have a lot of enzymes that are produced in the sprouting, and if you're drying it at very low temperature, which we do, we just dehydrate to stop the sprouting process and to maintain all of the things that occur during sprouting. One of those being a lot of enzymes are produced. The vitamins and minerals that are in the dormant grain can actually increase, some of them 100-fold. So we'll take a raw grain lot and test the nutrition on it, and then test the same sprouted lot, and you really can tell a difference. So you've got a really super food, so to speak, at this point. Beta carotene can increase several hundredfold that we've seen. Another wonderful thing about sprouting grain is, besides the enzymes and the added nutrition, a portion of the starch, though a small portion, is broken down into simple sugars. So it brings out the individual taste of all the different grains. Spelt, from the picture earlier, has a very nutty taste, where kamut, another wheat variety, has a very buttery taste. And all the bitterness that sometimes you find in grains is just eliminated in the sprouting process. Also, another thing, there's a natural barrier on the outside of all seeds, whether you want to call them grains or seeds, and it phytates and anti-nutrients. And in the sprouting process, that's broken down. So it makes the added nutrition of sprouted grains a lot more accessible for your body to use, and it eases the digestion. We also sprout a lot of legumes. So by the same token, you've got a much chewier texture to a sprouted legume because some of the starch has been broken down. It also has an enhanced taste, and it gets rid of a lot of the bloating that a lot of people experience with legumes. So those are some of the benefits of sprouting. So a couple of years ago, Peter and I were talking, and I said, Peter, besides me and Joe on the sprouted grain block now, there are several emerging sprouters, and we really have a concern with maintaining not only the integrity of the sprouted grain industry, but maybe we should take a look at setting some standards, some industry standards for what constitutes a sprouted grain. And so Peter got in touch with Cynthia Harriman with the Whole Grain Council, and Abby is here today. And Cynthia graciously agreed that it was a good idea that we bring everyone to the round table who is interested in talking about what constitutes a sprouted grain, to see if we could come up with some specific measurements, not only for new people coming aboard in the sprouting business, but also for manufacturers of sprouted products who are interested in doing that. So at the end of phase one, we have not set industry standards, but we have come up with 4 distinct measurements that we could use to call a grain sprouted. The visible sprouts, of course, as I've shown you, and enzyme actions with the increase of especially alpha amylase that occurs during sprouting, and being able to measure that in gluten grains using the Perton falling number measurement. In a good sprouted grain, you'll have a 40 to 60% reduction in falling number from the raw grain to sprouted. RVA, or the Rapid Viscosity Analyzer, is another way that you can measure the sproutedness of a grain. In some of the gluten-free grains, the amino acid increase, such as GABA in rice, in brown rice. That is another measurement that we have come up with. And then the phytates and the anti-nutrients that I was talking about earlier, the phytate reduction of at least 50%. We sprout oats. It's one of our most popular items, and our sprouting process can reduce the phytates in oats by 60%, which is great because that aids in digestion, and oats are so very popular for all kinds of different foods and not just breakfast cereals. Some additional measurements, also I talked about the starch reduction, especially in legumes, and then the nutritional increases. We don't have an in-house lab, but we do use extensively third-party labs for a lot of analysis. And we have to test our process, especially with a new product, at least several times in order to establish that our process is consistently going to make specific changes each time we sprout that particular product. So this is a beautiful bread using our red wheat flour, and you can see the bonds that have formed there, and it's just very lovely. Here's the texture of that same loaf of bread. And this was actually baked in a workshop, Peter, at Alon's Bakery in Atlanta, remember? Yeah. So you see that sprouted grains makes beautiful bread. This is a sprouted spelt boule that has been baked sourdough, and it's quite beautiful as well. The spelt is a wonderful wheat variety to bake with. I'm sure you all are aware of that. And these are some sprouted bagels, actually. And some of the advantages of baking with sprouted flours that I've talked about. For a commercial baker, you're talking about a lot of time saving, possibly. I guess it depends on your process, but it reduces the need to knead. And proof time comes a lot quicker depending on the kind of bread that you're baking. It reduces the need for added ingredients. Sometimes there's no need to add gluten, flour to most of your breads. And like I talked about earlier too, it enhances the taste of the individual grains. So what about the future of sprouting? I like to dabble in whatever a customer might call and ask me to sprout. So we're seeing sprouted hummus come on the market. Chickpeas is something that we sprout. And I've started sprouting spices, which, by the way, enhances the taste of the different spices. And you dry them, and I can grind them fresh for whatever I might be cooking in the kitchen that evening. And I very successfully sprouted some green coffee beans a few weeks ago and had a coffee expert actually roast them and rate them on the coffee rating. I have no idea what that is, but he said, wow, it rated very high, and he said it's a lovely coffee, so who knows. As long as I've got my mason jar, I'm going to keep sprouting. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. So we're going to have Joe and Caroline come up and talk a little bit about, focus more on the wheat side now. And now that Peggy sort of laid out a general picture of the world, you going to do it from the podium? And are we set for your? Make sure we get your slideshow in there. I found in talking with Peggy last night about her presentation, this last thing she mentioned is I hadn't even thought about that is the idea of sprouting spices and what the implications of that are. But it got my wheels spinning, and that's kind of what I'm hoping that some of the things that we're hearing today are going to get some of your wheels spinning as well. How many of you are already doing anything with sprouted grains in your work? So quite a few. So it's not all, this is not new to you. And hopefully for some of you that aren't but may see some implications, a couple years ago we could safely say, we see it's coming, sooner or later it's going to tip over, and I think we're now pretty close to the tipping point. So while they get started, I'm going to start passing out some. You want me to pass out the cookies and breads? We'll pass out both cookies and breads made by Carolyn.
All right, so while Peter is getting that passed out, I'm just going to hand out, these are some samples of our Super Sprout sprouted flour so you can see it, and feel free to open those up and touch it and smell it if you'd like. I thought you might like to have a little example. We also have, for our samples, we have some Super Sprout cookies. Chocolate chip cookies is just the Toll House cookie recipe made with 100% substitution of Super Sprout instead of the all-purpose flour. And then also some of Peter Reinhardt's recipe for Super Sprout bread. The most simple recipe possible is Super Sprout, water, yeast, and salt. So hopefully you enjoy that. The cookies I had to make on Monday, because when you're making for 200 people, you have to start fast. All right.
Okay, today we're going to talk about a little bit about our company, which is Lindley Mills, and our sprouted flour, which we call Super Sprout, and the benefits to bakers and consumers.
Our company, Lindley Mills, was established in 1755 by my 7 times great-grandfather. It was the site of a Revolutionary War battle in 1781, and it operates in the same location today. While it was out of the family a little bit in the 1840s, Joe and his father started restoring it in the 1970s and started grinding organic grains just like our ancestors would have more than 260 years ago on a water-powered grist mill. So today we mill 100% organic wheat, spelt, rye, corn, a variety of ancient grains, and have been doing the North Carolina soft and hard local wheat for decades. Our sprouted flours are both organic and conventional, and we offer sprouted flour blends as well for more traditional performance. Here you can see some of our certifications, which include a AA rating for food safety with the BRC. Our customers include large and small bakeries, food processors, national grocery stores, and restaurants across the U.S. You'd certainly be familiar with our products and have had them before, but we'll let them do their own advertising today. We're really excited to announce that we're going to be opening our new 30,000 square foot facility in a couple of weeks, adjacent to our original 1755 location. Our new facility is primarily going to be focused on supersprout production, but it will also allow us to add some local jobs and some more local grain intake.
So how do we get to supersprout, our sprouted wheat flour? Well, my milling journey began in 1975 when we restored the original Lindley's mill and put a water wheel in, and I moved a set of stones in from another local mill, and I ground my first whole wheat flour. Actually, it was organically grown then from Texas, but and immediately I was hooked, and I thought, I've got to figure out a way to make a living doing this, because I really liked it, and I guess I'm a 40-year plus addict for milling, but I always had a passion to try to develop a whole grain, whole wheat flour that tasted better than whole wheat, was more consumer friendly, and was really more nutritional. So over the years, I've worked, experimented, done research, gotten baker feedback, and so this sort of the supersprout flour, the process that we do it with is kind of the culmination of a greatest hits of all my milling experience, so to speak.
Although we sprout other grains, today we're going to talk primarily about wheat. Wheat is unique in the plant world because, as we've heard today, it contains the gluten strength that allows us to bake leavened bread. Wheat provides the biggest challenge when sprouting because of the need to maintain baking viability, but it also offers the greatest opportunity to deliver nutrition, as wheat provides 1/5 of the world's food calories every day. Some of the benefits of supersprout include enhanced flavor, increased nutrition and bioavailability, improved digestibility for both the non-celiac, gluten-sensitive, and diabetic populations, higher hydration and therefore increased yield, and longer shelf life.
Okay, how do we define it? As Peggy mentioned, and we all went through this with the Whole Grain Council. They did a great job mediating all of it, but there was a lot of input. So what we decided to do was just come up with our own definition for it, and that is supersprout is a unique, optimally sprouted whole grain flour derived from clean, sound, post-harvest wheat and potable water. So the wheat's been sprouted, tested, monitored, and then at what we consider to be the optimal point for maintaining baking viability, we stabilize it into this powder that she's passing around now. The process that we use really is proprietary, but what we're doing actually is the only way you can sprout anything that I'm aware of is you're managing the ambient environment of the grain. Just what you would expect. It's the grain, the water, the temperature, the light, the air, the time, and magic, of course, to get it to work. But it's all pretty basic, pretty simple, but it is management of the environment, of its environment, through the whole way through the process, and then testing to determine. And what we're using now is either, of course, you've got the visual sprout. Sometimes you don't have any kind of visual sprout. And so what we use as our metric really is the falling number test, which is what you're doing is indirectly measuring the alpha amylase activity, which is the starch viscosity, really is what it is, starch to sugar. So that's what we do. We do a lot of in-house testing, which what we're testing is just standard flour stuff: protein, moisture, ash, falling number. We run Freeform on it which will give you the quality of it. It gives you absorption, development time, stability. And we have we do the mycotoxins also, but we have a third-party program that we have that we call batch hold, control, and release program for, since we're introducing water into anything, there's potential for some other unwanted items there. So we do it as batch, and then we have it sent third-party tested for any pathogen problems it might be, yeast, mold, that kind of thing. And then that's what we make our decision on to release it. So that's pretty much the testing part, I guess.
Now that we've defined supersprout, let's talk about what is most important: flavor and functionality. What we're looking at here are a bunch of different baked goods that are made with supersprout by bakers within about 100 miles of the mill. It's a really versatile flour. The supersprout process converts starches to simple sugars, creating a naturally more sweet and nutty taste. It breaks down protein chains, allowing your body to digest it more like a vegetable than a grain. As your fellow bakers have said, this flour requires greater hydration and achieves some of the goals accomplished by pre-ferments. It also performs differently on the bench, like pudding, than white or whole wheat flours. But if you give it the time to absorb the additional water that it needs to fulfill its potential, you will get an amazing bread.
And of course, if beyond functionality and flavor, there is nutrition, a great nutrition impact with enhanced bioavailability, plus to change the soluble fiber, beta-carotene, iron, folic acid, the omega fatty acids, B vitamins come up. And it's interesting, this is when I first started experimenting around with it, that was really the first thing I did, because I wanted to have it tested independently, just to make sure that something was going on that was, that it was a valid thing. I think we all kind of intuitively know that something sprouted is better. It's going to be better for you nutrition-wise. But from an international or global perspective, sprouted flour really offers a huge, significant, I think, nutritional benefit because of the phytic acid that we've talked about, the reduction in that the acid doesn't let us absorb the calcium, iron, and zinc. But with the sprouted flour, you can absorb that. And since a lot of the world's diets are plant-based, the plant-based is a staple, really. It would have a great nutritional impact if they could absorb some of this iron, some of these other things that the phytic acid keeps from them. And it would impact it because I guess a third of the world suffers from anemia, and zinc deficiencies. So we think it would be a great thing, internationally.
Recently, researchers at the University of Scranton have examined polyphenols and antioxidant levels as a result of sprouting. They tested antioxidant levels of the dormant whole wheat flour and then the live sprouted whole wheat flour from the same source wheat. They found a significant increase in antioxidants in the live sprouted flour. The researchers also tested more than 20 different snack products for antioxidant levels. As you can see, the sprouted pretzels that were made with 100% sprouted flour were the clear winner. They doubled the antioxidant level of the next runner-up. So apparently, the increased antioxidant level due to sprouting does survive the baking process. If you think about it, all baked goods from thousands and thousands of years ago have been made from the flour from the stored dormant wheat seed. It was a renewable, reliable source of food year-round. Supersprout sprouted flour is revolutionary in the sense that we are waking up that dormant seed, making it live again, controlling its environment variables just like you would a starter or a pre-ferment, and then making it into flour. Just imagine the amazing energy and life force that springs from a single seed. I can't even get a single seed out here, but there's a few of them. A single seed with just the right environment to a fully grown wheat field and a wheat stalk with multiple seeds on it. Supersprout further transforms the dormant seed, allowing it to fulfill its true destiny and sprout.
Bread's past, as we've heard today, very eloquently, has involved pre-ferment, sponges, starters, sourdough loaves that take on the culture of the communities and environments that they're created in, the microorganisms, the yeast, the bacteria. But more recently, we've moved away from that diverse living culture towards a more highly processed, speed-focused bread production. The sprout actually achieves some of the goals of a pre-ferment, but also additionally captures the energy and life force and nutrition of the germinating seed. So we feel like we're at the beginning of a bread renaissance that will actually rely on sprouted whole grain flours. The future of bread and baking in the next 100 years really lies in the past, as sprouted flour will help bring us back to the natural life cycle of bread and reconnects us with the flavors and nutrition that will sustain us in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I like that's a great segue to tomorrow's opening talk, The Future of Bread Lies in Its Past. We'll be hearing from Carl Torr. That's a theme that Puratos has embraced as a sort of an in-house mantra, and it just seems to, never more true to be able to come full circle. It's just from something so ancient. And of course, sprouted breads have been around for about the last 60 years in the United States in a different form through like Ezekiel bread and Alvarado Street breads. They use a sprouted grain pulp. This is the sort of the next, I think, iteration of it is actually what they're doing is drying that pulp into a flour, which then can be transported and is shelf stable. So I'm just adding that on because that's what got me excited. The two takeaways when I did my research with both of them for my book was the phytic acid point, which is like that alone was kind of like, whoa, wow, they can do that. And then, but then even that was dwarfed by the more important thing, which is always the most important thing, is flavor. And so for me, when the difference in flavor, the way it sweetened things up, I thought this has got to be, a big part of the future of bread. So we've got a few minutes for some questions, conversations. Let's take some questions, and let me make sure I get the mic to you so it gets on the live stream.
Can you use the super sprout, or how can you use the super sprout in relation to whole wheat flour? Is it 1 for 1, or is there a variation of the formula you need to do?
Well, you can use it 1-to-1. These cookies were actually a 1-to-1 substitution for all-purpose flour. It's what the recipe is on the back of the Nestle chocolate chip bag that made. It's just a simple 1-to-1 recipe. Sometimes it requires, or it would like a little more hydration, a little more water than than whole wheat even.
I will speak to that too for a second, because by the same token, our sprouted flours, for the most part, can be substituted cup for cup in recipes. I believe the hydration point is probably the most important one, especially if you're baking with einkorn flour. Einkorn, it requires a little more working with it to make one of your favorite recipes work. It has a higher absorption percentage in most recipes.
Well, what I found when I was testing it, I went from a typical like French bread, which would be made 66 to 68% hydration, water to flour. When I started working with both of their flours, I was closer to 90% hydration. It starts out seeming to be too wet, wetter than a ciabatta dough, but by the time you kind of do some folds and everything else and let it absorb, because it takes a little while for it to fully hydrate, then all of a sudden it starts to feel like a baguette dough, a soft baguette dough. So I made some products with both of their flours, like focaccias and ciabattas, up to 100% hydration, because it can absorb that much. And I think that's one difference that I found, and this is where the public issue comes in with many companies out there. Not every brand performs the same. So it was difficult to write about it, because if somebody has access to a different brand out on the West Coast, is it going to be the same? Not necessarily. Depends on partly how much it's dried, how well it's dried, and probably also the particular wheat that you're using. I'm guessing that there's a lot of factors that determine it. So you have to kind of start out knowing the flour, work with the flour, find your hydration sweet spot, so to speak. But definitely more water, and that's where you save the money. The money, the added cost that you're paying for their process, you're going to make up for some of that by adding the least expensive ingredient, in terms of water. More questions? We have one up there.
Yeah, when we bake a bread with just the regular wheat flour and a sourdough starter, the real sourdough starter, I mean, that does reduce the phytic acid and it does increase the nutritional level. How is that bread different from the bread that is baked with the sprouted flour? Is at the nutritional level?
I would just, the first obvious answer, and I'll let you take it, is if you're talking about a sourdough made with white flour versus a sprouted wheat bread, which
Sourdough
starts
with
as
the
a whole
regular
grain.
wheat flour, not the white flour. But
Okay,
the
so
whole,
wheat for wheat. Okay,
yes,
whole wheat for
wheat. But
Okay.
sprouted versus non-sprouted.
Go ahead.
The biggest difference you're going to see is the nutrition, because in just using conventional wheat that hasn't been sprouted and you're making a sourdough, even though it's going to be, phytic acid, you may have breakdown and it's going to be very digestible. What's not occurring are the nutritional increases that occur during the germination of the grain.
I think that, and I know that you have some things on your website that cite some of the research, and I know, Joe, you had some studies you sent me way back at the beginning that showed the difference in how the grain changes in its nutritional content. And I don't know how a grain picks up more vitamin or this, that. I'm guessing that it's just releasing the natural vitamins that are in there, inherent in there, that were not measurable before and not available before. But suddenly things like vitamin B, vitamin C, they all seem to bump up. So that
Making it live again.
because it's coming to life.
I mean,
Yeah.
So you're taking a dormant seed and making a living plant.
Right. Yeah. I'm still doubtful because when we add the sourdough starter, it actually is different from when we add the commercial yeast. Commercial yeast doesn't do any good for the bread or in terms of digestibility and in terms of breaking down the starches, which is done by the sourdough starter. I guess we'll have to look into which is more superior, sprouted versus non-sprouted with the sourdough starter. When I say sourdough starter, like the leavening agent, the regular, the old-fashioned way sourdough starter, which I think we are going to hear a lot tomorrow, I guess. Probably some of you guys can answer that question.
It's a really good question, and this is such a new frontier that I think that some of these things are going to need to be answered definitively. I think there's going to be some research that's required. There's anecdotal, mostly we have a lot of anecdotal, feedback, and because sourdough itself as a category is increasing in interest because of these digestibility positives and things like that. They're kind of running on parallel tracks. Whether you can say, okay, but this is still better. I think that it's going to be hard to give a definitive answer, but we got sort of stuff to work with here. Whether you have the mic.
I was curious about when it's sprouting, I imagine your falling numbers are dropping. And if you're approaching it baking and you're doing long, slow ferments, is that, to me, that question, it seems like you've got a flour that's alive or natural. So it's interesting that they're both, I think, really effective routes to the same, without any science behind me. It seems like it. But I'm curious, if you were to take the sprouted flour and do a long ferment, is it going to be more challenging? Is it going to break down too fast? You have to treat it the way you might treat rye, where you've got a quicker breakdown, so you have to maybe do a larger amount of culture and shorten your times that way. Are there adjustments to make up for the lack of falling numbers, which I'm just assuming here, but
you have to make adjustments because it jumps quicker.
There's more nutrition and bioavailability there in the sprouted flour, so
it's
there's
going to be more active.
there's more for the yeast to.
But you can still you can go either yeasted or natural leavening. You just need to find your path through it.
Yes.
Yeah, a couple of questions. First of all, how would the use of sprouted flour affect the need for pre-fermentation? For example, given that the amylase breakdown has already taken place, or the starch breakdown to a great extent, would that reduce or eliminate the need for, say, a poolish if you're, if you're baking yeasted breads. And the second question, if I can remember it, having a senior moment, has to do with partial addition of sprouted flours as an additive, because obviously a lot of commercial, regular standard milled flours have an addition of barley malt or malted barley flour. Would the addition of a sprouted grain flour, which in my understanding is essentially a malted grain flour, would that have the same impact in terms of improving fermentation performance of regular non-sprouted flours?
So, sprouted grain flour would be the same as malted grain flour. Yeah. So, and it is going to shorten the time because you've basically got pre-ferment with the sprouted grain. Quick answer.
Well, you could.
Already happened, yeah.
But you don't have to, but you could. You could chill it and retard it. But I think the way I wrote about it was simply that the pre-fermentation happened in nature. It happened in the sprouting process rather than in your mixing bowl. But there was the first question. Was that the first question? The first question had to do with the pre-ferment. Yeah. So I've talked to some people who still use a pre-ferment anyway because they just have this intuition that they'd like to. But I haven't found when I've done it that it improved flavor as a result. We got a question up here from Jeff, and then unfortunately we're gonna have coming to a break time, so we'll take one more. Then please continue asking, and they're going to be here. So let's keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Peter. As a baker, I've sprouted grain in the bakery and used it as an additive before, but as a microbiologist, one of the things I found was a concern for the generation of other organisms that come along when you put grain, and you sort of alluded to it briefly, and you said that you test for it. But on a commercial scale, how do you control for that? You mentioned mycotoxins, but that's just one small spectrum of the area when you're doing grains in a neutral pH and can generate all kinds of problems. And one obviously is the food poisoning aspect, which needs to be controlled. And the other one is wild yeast formation, which can, in a baking operation, maybe not in a milling operation, but a baking operation can wreak havoc in a bakery for generating wild yeast, which can contaminate your levain and that kind of thing. I'd interested in your comments on that.
Well, what I would say would be, if you, we do our flour, the super sprout flour, down below 12% moisture, and according to things I've read, anything below 12%, there is no other activity, or pretty much any activity, as you were speaking of, ceases.
Yeah, it's more about water activity, but I guess we can talk offline about that. I'm just curious to how you control that, because it's a delicate process.
So for mycotoxins, we require a certificate of analysis on the grain before we purchase it to keep those in control. In our process, we have a lethality step because, like I had mentioned, it takes a lot of water, it takes a controlled environment, and it takes a lot of time. So you do have the opportunity for microbials to grow. So we have it validated in our process, and we're SQF level 2 certified as well. So we control our environment very precisely to eliminate any possibility for that.
But this is a really important area for sure, especially with more companies getting in the game, which is exactly the reason why we convened that roundtable, because we felt that there was a need for standards for being able to answer those kinds of questions. And one of the things that one of my takeaways from that first initial roundtable was that it was hard. It was like herding cats. Everybody had their own idea of how. I think Joe and I used that term. We had our conversation afterwards. Was, man, it's like herding cats because everybody was kind of entrenched in their own way of doing it, and the ones that were the most entrenched were the ones that are the least forthcoming about their process. So I'm worried. I do worry about it as in terms of the public safety. Is what happens when everyone starts, other companies start getting in the game and aren't following some standards. So usually what'll force the issue is, some kind of a catastrophe, but we were hoping to head that off. So, but I think it's a really important question, so thank you for that.